He united a nation with law, fear, and unyielding power. But when scholars dared to question him, the ground became their grave. Witness the chilling reign of Qin Shi Huang and the mud wells of China. The Qin dynasty began in 221 BCE, marking the unification of China under Qin Shi Huang, the man who called himself the first emperor. His reign ended centuries of fragmented warring states and established the foundations of imperial rule that lasted for millennia. His governance was characterized by strict laws, centralization, and an unrelenting pursuit of control. Before unification, China was divided into 7 major warring states. Qin, situated in the west, was initially seen as a rough, militaristic region. However, under the reforms of statesman Yang, the Qin state adopted a system of legalism that prioritized absolute authority, harsh laws, and efficiency over moral philosophy or tradition. By the time Zheng, later known as Qin Shi Huang, came to power at the age of 13, Qin had become the most organized and disciplined of all the states. Through years of conquest and strategic diplomacy, he systematically defeated the other 6 states, Han, Zhao, Yan, Wei, Chu, and Qi, bringing all of them under one rule by 221 BCE. The newly unified China was restructured entirely. Qin Shi Huang abolished feudal divisions, centralized administration, and divided the empire into commanderies and counties governed by officials loyal to him, not by hereditary lords. This reform eliminated the risk of rebellion from regional powers and ensured direct imperial oversight across the vast territory. To consolidate his rule, the emperor standardized weights, measures, currency, and even the width of cart axles to improve trade and movement. He also established a uniform written script, allowing communication and record-keeping to become consistent throughout the empire. These reforms helped bind the vast regions of China into one functioning state. Qin Shi Huang's vision extended beyond politics. He ordered the construction of grand infrastructure projects that showcased his power. The Great Wall's early sections were linked under his command to repel nomadic invasions from the north. A vast network of roads connected distant regions, making troop movements and communication more efficient than ever before. However, these achievements came at immense human cost. Millions of laborers were conscripted for state projects, and failure to meet quotas often resulted in execution or severe punishment. The emperor viewed people as instruments of the state's survival, a reflection of the legalist doctrine that guided every decision he made. Legalism, the philosophy behind Qin governance, rejected moral teachings like those of Confucius and emphasized absolute obedience to law. The emperor believed that virtue was irrelevant if laws were not strictly enforced. This ideological stance formed the foundation for one of the most authoritarian systems in ancient history. The state's legal code prescribed harsh punishments for even minor infractions. Fines, forced labor, mutilation, and death were all common sentences. The Qin government viewed fear as an effective deterrent, and thus, cruelty became a tool of governance rather than an act of vengeance. This approach maintained order, but bred silent resentment among the population. Qin Shi Huang's court was filled with ministers, generals, and scholars who constantly monitored one another. Surveillance and reports of disloyalty were common, ensuring that fear permeated every level of the bureaucracy. The emperor's paranoia about dissent led him to establish an extensive spy network that reached every province. Despite his obsession with control, Qin Shi Huang was also fascinated with immortality. He commissioned expeditions in search of elixirs that could extend his life. Alchemists and magicians were brought to court, and vast sums of wealth were spent on rituals and materials believed to grant eternal life. None succeeded, but their failures often cost them their lives. The emperor's belief in his divine right to rule grew stronger with age. He claimed to be chosen by heaven to maintain order and saw his empire as an extension of cosmic balance. To question his authority was to question the will of heaven itself, an act considered both treasonous and blasphemous. His distrust of intellectuals and moral philosophers emerged as his empire grew more stable. He viewed Confucian scholars as threats because they valued tradition, virtue, and debate, all ideas that undermined the absolute obedience he demanded. Their advocacy for moral governance conflicted directly with his legalist principles. To preserve his version of order, the emperor began suppressing all teachings and writings that contradicted state ideology. Books promoting philosophy, poetry, or historical reflection were targeted. The imperial court decided that only texts concerning medicine, agriculture, and divination were necessary for the functioning of the empire. This campaign of suppression would later be remembered as one of the most infamous acts of cultural control in Chinese history. Scholars who opposed the new order were silenced, and historical records were rewritten to glorify the Qin dynasty. The emperor's goal was to erase the past so that only his rule defined the present and the future. The centralization of thought matched the centralization of power. Qin Shi Huang ordered that all surviving documents from the conquered states be delivered to the capital, Xianyang. These texts were reviewed by officials loyal to the regime, and those deemed subversive or misleading were condemned to destruction. The emperor's capital reflected his authority. Xianyang was transformed into a monumental city, filled with towering palaces, vast courtyards, and administrative complexes. Thousands of artisans and laborers worked endlessly to build what the emperor envisioned as the center of civilization itself. The wealth of all the former states poured into its construction. Foreign envoys and local governors were required to visit Xianyang to pay tribute and reaffirm loyalty. Every ceremony reinforced the emperor's dominance and the unity of the empire. He saw himself not as a ruler among men, but as the embodiment of the state itself. Despite the prosperity and order, fear remained the defining feature of Qin society. The people admired the emperor's achievements, but despised his methods. Strict surveillance, forced labor, and severe punishments left many citizens trapped between obedience and silent suffering. The emperor's court officials maintained absolute loyalty out of necessity rather than respect. Many secretly feared that any disagreement could be interpreted as treason. Within the walls of the palace, silence was the safest response to any imperial decree. By the final years of his reign, Qin Shi Huang ruled over the most powerful empire China had ever seen. His vision of unity had been realized through iron discipline and relentless enforcement. Roads stretched across the empire, walls protected its borders, and laws bound every citizen under a single order. Yet beneath this appearance of perfection, unrest was growing quietly among the people, the scholars, and even the emperor's own servants. His need to control every thought and action would soon lead to measures so extreme that they would be remembered as one of the darkest legacies in Chinese history. By the middle of Qin Shi Huang's rule, the empire had become a machine driven by absolute order. Every region functioned under the same laws, every citizen was registered, and every word written or spoken about the emperor was monitored. Yet this precision came at a heavy human cost, as the emperor's distrust of dissent turned to open hostility toward the scholars who questioned him. The emperor's council grew increasingly intolerant of differing opinions. Confucian scholars, known for their emphasis on moral governance and virtue, continued to criticize the empire's heavy reliance on punishment. They believed that order should come from moral example rather than terror. To Qin Shi Huang, such ideas were not only foolish but dangerous. In 213 BCE, the emperor summoned his ministers to discuss the growing influence of scholars. The court's legalist advisor, Li Si, warned him that the scholars' teachings threatened the stability of the state. He claimed that they clung to the past, quoting the histories of fallen dynasties, to question the emperor's reforms. Li Si argued that the preservation of old books encouraged rebellion through ideas. Quick reminder, if you are enjoying, do like the video and subscribe the channel for upcoming historical content. Qin Shi Huang accepted Li Si's counsel without hesitation. A decree was issued that all historical and philosophical writings outside of state-approved works be destroyed. Only texts concerning medicine, agriculture, or divination were allowed to survive. This was the beginning of the infamous burning of the books, a policy that sought to erase intellectual independence from the empire. Imperial messengers were dispatched to every province with orders to inspect private libraries and confiscate forbidden texts. Piles of bamboo scrolls and wooden tablets were gathered in city squares and set on fire. The flames consumed centuries of Chinese scholarship, poetry, history, and philosophy, turning them into ash in the name of unity. The emperor believed that the destruction of books would eliminate rebellion in thought. However, the scholars themselves became the next targets. Many refused to surrender their writings or renounce their beliefs. Some continued to teach Confucian ethics in secret, believing it their duty to preserve truth against tyranny. The emperor viewed their defiance as treason. Reports of secret gatherings among intellectuals reached the palace. The legalist ministers urged swift punishment, claiming that such disobedience would inspire rebellion if not crushed immediately. The emperor ordered mass arrests of those accused of opposing imperial law. Hundreds of scholars were taken from their homes and brought to the capital, Xianyang. They were interrogated by imperial officials, often under duress. Those who confessed to possessing forbidden texts were imprisoned, while others who refused to cooperate were sentenced to death. Yet Qin Shi Huang sought a method of execution that would symbolize the weight of the earth-crushing descent. It was during this period that the punishment known as the mud wells began to appear. These pits, dug deep into the wet soil near the capital, were filled with thick mud and water. Prisoners were lowered into them until only their heads remained above the surface. The mud slowly closed around their bodies as they struggled for air. The mud wells were designed not merely to kill but to silence. The condemned could neither move nor speak once submerged. Their slow suffocation was witnessed by guards who recorded the event as proof of imperial justice. It was a punishment that reflected both the cruelty of the regime and its obsession with control over every aspect of human life. Historical accounts suggest that dozens, perhaps hundreds of scholars met their end in these pits. They were buried alive, their faces turning pale as the mud crept higher with each passing hour. To the emperor, this was not barbarity, it was the fulfillment of law. The act served as a warning to all who dared question imperial authority. The mud wells were often dug near construction sites, where forced laborers could see the scholars suffering. The emperor intended these displays to remind the people that intellect and dissent held no power against the law. Each death reinforced the idea that survival depended solely on obedience. The emperor's court officials kept meticulous records of every execution. Those who carried out the sentences were rewarded with gold, land, or promotion. The regime turned brutality into a bureaucratic process, ensuring that cruelty was conducted with administrative precision. The act of punishment became as systematic as tax collection. The mud itself became a symbol of imperial control. It represented the weight of the empire, crushing all resistance beneath it. As the scholars disappeared beneath the earth, so too did the last remnants of free thought within the Qin dynasty. The emperor's decree had not only killed men, but silenced generations of knowledge. Qin Shi Huang took pride in what he saw as the purification of China's intellect. He believed that by erasing old teachings, he was creating a new moral order, one defined by obedience rather than reflection. His empire would have no philosophers to question him and no historians to compare his reign to others. Reports of these executions spread quietly through the provinces. The people spoke of them in whispers, fearful of being accused of sympathy for the condemned. Families of the scholars were often exiled or forced into labor. The emperor's fear of rebellion had transformed into an empire-wide culture of silence. The emperor's officials continued to identify and arrest those suspected of harboring forbidden ideas. Public confessions were staged, where scholars were forced to denounce their peers before being taken away. Each event reaffirmed the emperor's total dominance over body and thought alike. Yet not all within the court supported the killings. Some ministers feared that the destruction of scholarship would weaken the empire's intellectual foundations. They cautioned the emperor that governance required wisdom as well as strength. Their objections were ignored and in some cases punished as defiance. The emperor's paranoia deepened with each passing year. He saw conspiracies everywhere, among nobles, servants, and even within his own family. The mud wells became not only a punishment for scholars, but also a tool for eliminating anyone accused of betrayal or disloyalty. Political rivals, soldiers, and servants alike could vanish into the earth. As the number of victims grew, the emperor ordered that the executions be conducted away from the palace to maintain the illusion of peace in Xianyang. The pits were moved to remote areas near rivers and farmlands. Still, the stories spread. told by workers who claimed to hear faint cries rising from the earth long after the victims had perished. By the end of his reign, the emperor's campaign against knowledge had transformed the empire's intellectual landscape. Libraries were empty, scholars were gone, and fear replaced curiosity. The Qin dynasty stood as the most unified power in Chinese history, but it had buried its wisdom beneath layers of mud and silence. The emperor continued to rule with unchallenged authority, surrounded by loyal ministers and terrified subjects. Yet his quest for absolute control had come at the cost of humanity and learning. In the stillness of his vast palace, Qin Shi Huang ruled an empire where no one dared to think aloud. In the final years of Qin Shi Huang's reign, the empire he built began to fracture beneath the surface. The same fear that had silenced the scholars now spread through his officials and soldiers. Obedience turned to exhaustion, and loyalty became fragile. The emperor, once the embodiment of order, became isolated within his own creation. The emperor's obsession with immortality deepened as he aged. He feared death as the one enemy he could not conquer. Alchemists promised elixirs of eternal life, but many contained mercury and other poisons. The emperor consumed them daily, believing they would grant him endless rule, unaware that they slowly destroyed his body. Despite his failing health, Qin Shi Huang continued to tour his empire to display authority. He traveled with vast retinues, carrying thousands of soldiers and servants. His journeys became processions of silence, with entire villages ordered indoors as his convoy passed. The people no longer cheered, they merely watched from behind closed doors. During one of these journeys in 210 BCE, the emperor fell ill near the eastern coast. His ministers concealed his condition, fearing chaos if news of his death spread. They continued to issue decrees in his name as his health declined. In his final days, the emperor's body weakened, but his mind remained fixed on control and secrecy. When he died, the court hid his death for weeks. His body was placed in a carriage surrounded by barrels of fish to mask the smell of decay. Orders continued to flow under his seal, even as his corpse rotted within the imperial procession. The symbol of eternal order had succumbed to the natural decay he tried to defy. After his death, chaos erupted. Power struggles broke out between officials and princes. The strict system that had held the empire together began to collapse without the emperor's iron hand. Rebellions flared across provinces, led by peasants and former soldiers who had suffered under his rule. Within 3 years, the Qin dynasty fell. The infrastructure, the walls, and the laws remained, but the fear that had sustained them dissolved. The people rose against the regime that had buried their scholars and silenced their minds. The empire that once sought eternal unity lasted only 15 years after unification. The mudwells, once symbols of authority, became sites of memory and horror. Farmers avoided the land where scholars had been buried. Some claimed the earth still bubbled when rain fell, as if the ground itself remembered the lives it had swallowed. The wells stood as mute reminders of the empire's cruelty. Qin Shi Huang's legacy remained divided. He unified China and shaped its foundations, yet he also demonstrated the dangers of absolute power and the destruction of thought. The emperor had sought eternity through control, but his name endured instead as a lesson in the impermanence of tyranny.